Welcome to the Martin Bailey Photography Podcast. It's October 16, 2018, and this is episode 635. In this week's podcast, I'm going to relay my thoughts on spending lots of time on lengthy post-processing techniques to improve our images, or more accurately, what I do to avoid spending this time, including some self-acceptance advice based on communication with a listener. This episode was spurred by a recent email exchange with listener Evan Stewart from Missouri. So I wanted to start by thanking Evan for the email and your questions and providing some food for thought. In the exchange, Evan asked how much I use Photoshop and mentioned that he is at a point in his photography where he can't help being curious about trying more advanced techniques such as focus stacking, exposure blending and luminosity masking, and was asking if I used some of these techniques in my own photography. My reply may well be useful to others, so I decided to share and expand on that reply here on the blog today. To set the stage and to relay a kind of disclaimer about what I'll follow on to, I will start by saying what I said to Evan in a follow-up to my main reply, which is that some people feel as though they must spend hours on a photo to make it good, and I feel for them. Also, though, I do understand that some people simply enjoy working on images, and if that's the case, it's certainly not my place to tell you that you shouldn't do anything. I personally do not enjoy spending a lot of time on any image, which is why I shoot and process the way I do, as I'll explain shortly. But I can spend hours on my computer doing other things. It's all personal preference, so please understand that what I'm going to talk about today is not condemning anyone for spending time on images if that's what you like doing. If, however, you find yourself spending a lot of time working on images to rescue them, and the time you spend is putting pressure on you, it may well be time wasted. So I hope that what I'll relay today will help you to save some of that time, hopefully enabling you to spend it doing something else more enjoyable. In reply to Evan's question about how much I use Photoshop to process my images, I said that I use Photoshop to work on my photos very rarely. Probably less than 0.1% of my images are edited outside of Capture One Pro, but when they are, I use Photoshop. I used to edit some of my images in the Nik software suite, namely Silver Efex Pro and Color Efex Pro, but I haven't used these applications at all since switching to Capture One Pro just over 2 years ago now. Some of the effects that I was getting can be done in Photoshop, but I did like the results that I was getting with Nik until Capture One Pro gave me an alternative that I liked. Partly because of how I shoot, I actually spend less than 30 seconds on the vast majority of my images. Occasionally, I shoot something that requires more work, say for example if there are power lines running through a scene, and I decide that I want to shoot it anyway. This kind of photo would require more work, but even then, I generally don't spend more than 5 minutes or so. I understand that how little I do may result in my images not being quite as impactful as some of the work of other photographers, but this is my style and I personally enjoy my results. As I've mentioned before, I'm under no delusions that I'm some kind of an amazing photographer, but I do make work that I'm happy with. And for the vast majority of photographers out there, I think that this is a good place to be with your work. Having said that, I also think that it's important to make a distinction between being content with our work and being complacent. Being content leaves room for improvement, and I'm always on the lookout for a better photograph and ways to improve my work. but I want to make those changes in the field during the creation of the images, not after the event on my computer. Complacency, on the other hand, leaves no room for improvement, and this is a place that I never want to be. Even though I shoot some locations every year, there is always an opportunity to improve, and being self-critical is vitally important to that process. And for me, this self-criticality starts in the field, while I still have a chance to change my raw materials, literally my raw images. That statement reminds me of a time when Jeffrey Friedel, who you may know for his amazing Lightroom plugins, pulled me up for spelling RAW in capitals like an acronym. Jeffrey is probably one of the smartest people I know, and I realized that I'd been getting this wrong when he told me that raw images literally are just raw, as in not cooked, rather than RAW meaning something else. It doesn't help that most camera manufacturers and many people in the industry also use RAW in capital letters, but I can say with my hand on my heart that since Jeffrey explained this to me, I have not only always used lowercase raw, but I think I've had a deeper appreciation for what raw images really are. And this also leads nicely to one of the main reasons that I work hard not to make copies of my images in a format that takes me away from my raw files. The moment you export and edit your images in a program like Photoshop or the Nik plugins, you will eventually end up saving your image in a format other than your original raw image format. And once you do that, you lose the ability to easily update your photographs to the latest and greatest versions of the processing engines that come with your chosen image editing and management software. I use Capture One Pro, but this is the same with Lightroom and many other applications that are what we call non-destructive. When I first started using Capture One Pro just over 2 years ago, it was at version 9, and since then there have been 2 major releases taking us to version 11, and both of these releases have brought improved image processing with an updated processing engine. When I first processed the image that we'll look at in a moment, I had some cloning to do that was not possible in Lightroom. So my only option at the time was to take my image into Photoshop to do my editing. This was one of the rare times when I round-tripped out of Lightroom and ended up with a PSD file with my changes baked in. I resented the time I'd spent in Photoshop though, within just a few weeks. I'd taken my original photo into Silver Efex Pro and converted it to black and white, but as I lived with the image, I realized that I made the trunks of the trees in the foreground a little too dark. I had to go back into Silver Efex Pro and reprocess it, and that meant that I also had to go back into Photoshop and clone out the cable car lines a second time. This felt like such a waste of time to me. Then, a few months later, in the summer of 2016, I switched to Capture One Pro, and during my initial tests of the product, I used the same image to see if I could both create black and white images that were as good, if not better, than Silver Efex Pro, and I checked to see if I could do cloning in Capture One Pro, so that I could avoid baking my changes into a destructive file format rather than keeping them in their original RAW format. It turned out that Capture One Pro passed both of these tests, so now I had a copy of my original RAW file with all of the cloning done in Capture One. So when versions 10 and then 11 came out, I just clicked a button to update the processing engine, and the image grew incrementally better, with more subtle detail and better handling of the shadows. I was able to improve my photo twice with no more effort than a couple of mouse clicks, simply because I had been able to keep my image in its original RAW format. So this is a major time saver and benefit. Let's take a look at the image I'm referring to as we start to discuss more of the methods that I use to help improve my photography and save me time in post-processing. Since I started shooting digital back in 2000, I made a conscious decision to kill two birds with one stone. I'm not a purist in the sense that I will not clone anything out of my images, but I don't like to make the decision to do so lightly. I want to modify the content of my images based on deliberate, conscious decisions. Coupled with a desire to create images that require as little as possible work on the computer, I decided to train myself to be more observant in the field by sticking to my personal policy of not removing anything that I was not aware of when I exposed the photograph. If I didn't see it in the field, I do not allow myself to change it later in post-processing. What this means is that if I see the cable car lines running through a scene, I am okay with removing them later. But if I do not see the cable car lines or anything else distracting in the image until I get it onto my computer, I do not allow myself to remove the distraction. I'm left with two options: live with the annoying element or throw out the image, and 99% of the time I go with the latter option. To illustrate this, let's look at a photograph from Mount Asahi in Hokkaido, with the lines of a cable car running through the scene. I knew about these when I composed the photograph, but I liked this scene so much that I decided to spend the time to remove them later. There is actually also a large pillar to support the cables, but I positioned my camera so that I hid that behind the third foreground tree from the left. Another decision that I made to help save me time on the computer. To see the cables on the left side of the photo, you'll need to go over to the blog at mbp.ac/635 and grab the vertical line in the middle of the photo and drag it over to the left side. You'll see the cables behind the trees across most of the left side of the photograph. Another minor benefit of keeping my images in RAW is that I could show you the processed black and white image today and just turn off the cloning adjustments for the before-after images. I've found though that my policy of not allowing myself to remove anything that I didn't see when I initially made the photo has really helped me to be more deliberate in my compositions. There were times when I had to throw out images that I otherwise really liked, so I soon learned that I had to do better. It's surprising how much a little self-kicking can do. I really do recommend it to all photographers. Evan had asked if I had come to peace with not using any exposure blending techniques, but for me it's not so much a case of coming to peace with not using techniques like exposure blending. I really just don't believe it's necessary. Part of this in my case is because I don't often shoot in very bright weather that might cause really high contrast images, but apart from a few times well over 10 years ago, when our cameras weren't as capable as they are now, I really just haven't photographed any scenes that, in my mind, needed more than one frame to capture the necessary dynamic range. Part of this is also my own sense of the aesthetic. You might remember me talking about this next photo earlier this year about how I often let windows go white in my Namibia work from Colemanskop. This is not because I'm too lazy to take multiple shots and blend them together, but because I really just prefer to see the images that way. It leaves more to the imagination and to me feels more surreal than a photo where we can see both the inside of the room and the exterior perfectly exposed. Similarly, I don't mind in this photo that the walls are leaning outwards from the angle that I shot this. That is not to say that I never do any keystone adjustments, mind. I do, but only when the effects that I remove are a distraction for me. I think people sometimes feel that they have to remove any and all form of distortion, and again, that's each individual's decision to make. But personally, I don't feel that every photograph has to be absolutely perfect in this respect. In complete contradiction to that sense of not caring with regards to the previous image though, note that I do quite often take the time to ensure that my camera is at just the right height to prevent my vertical lines from leaning in at least part of the time. This falls under my heading of being deliberate. I find it ironic that the same word pronounced differently has both ends of the spectrum covered for me in this respect. I won't deliberate over some issues, such as leaning walls or spending hours on an image in post, but I absolutely will be deliberate and take the time necessary to craft my compositions so that everything is just as I want it, as I did for this photograph, where I moved the frame on the floor to a more pleasing location and spent extra time ensuring that my camera was at the right height to get all of the vertical lines perfectly straight. I guess it's also ironic that I completely don't care that we can't see everything out of the windows to the right in this shot as well. I think my point is, once again, that we have to develop a sense of what we are happy with, and in many respects, this takes time and confidence in our work. As I think about this for today's post, I realize that Evan's email to me that prompted this post had a more appropriate subject than I had initially thought. I started this post with a different title, but as I write, I've adopted the subject of Evan's mail, which was Developing Your Style and Self-Acceptance. In some areas of my photography, I'm a stickler for getting it right and ensuring that everything is perfect. But in other areas, I simply decide to not give a hoot. And that really does come from reaching a point where you cannot care what other people think. Having the confidence to say that it simply is not important to be able to see what's outside, and deciding that the walls leaning outwards doesn't matter, comes from having a sense of self-acceptance. If you listen to everything that everyone will tell you, it can be quite paralyzing, as you really will never be able to please everybody. This is where the significance of your trusted critique comes into play, and equally important is developing the ability to ignore the words of the untrusted critique. I've mentioned a number of times in the past that my wife is who I consider my main trusted critique, although there are a few others around the world whose advice I will heed. Whenever I have a decision to make about my photography or any other creative pursuit for that matter, I don't consider my work to be complete until I've run it past my wife. Her advice means everything to me, but I should note that I don't take on board everything she says. There are times when I like something that she doesn't, and at the end of the day, it's my art, and I have the final word. But, for example, if I'm working on a set of images, say a portfolio, or a selection of work to send a client, 9 times out of 10, if she says that something has to go, it goes. A lot of the time, I use her opinion to check my own suspicions, and over the years I've learnt to preempt her advice and simply remove images that I know she will dislike. I also recall a story from my good friend Graham Morgan, an award-winning photographer from Australia, who was on his way home from Antarctica and showed his wife a photo that he was about to delete, but she told him to keep it. The following year, he won something like the Australia Nature Photographer of the Year with that photo. This is a powerful reminder of the need to seek advice from a trusted critique. It's also an important reminder that making the final decision on photos that we've shot straight after shooting them isn't always a good idea. Giving yourself at least a few days, ideally a week or more after a shoot, to make a more objective decision about your work is very important. When I return from a trip, I generally want to start talking about it within just a few days, so I force myself to complete at least a preliminary cull as soon as possible after getting home. But then I always continue to refine the selection for another week or two until I make my final selection. Invariably, I find that as the memory of the shoot fades, I am able to be more ruthless in my selection, and the more we can remove from a selection, the more condensed and rich the final set will be. As I mentioned earlier in part of my reply to Evan, I had also stated that if you are careful with your exposure, you can generally get a better quality image from a single frame than from blending. Now, I realize that there are techniques that can help to blend images together without really being able to tell it was done, but the majority of the time they still require more work than I personally am prepared to put into each individual image. So once again, this is a personal preference. My advice to people has always been that if using exposure blending or any other HDR techniques feeds your creativity, then go for it. If, however, you're doing it to overcome limitations of the camera, then first learn how to expose your images to get maximum dynamic range in a single image. Then decide whether or not you need HDR. Once you get used to looking at the histogram, there isn't even any guesswork. You can see right on the back of your camera if the image fits in a single frame, simply by referencing your histogram. Now, I've talked about ETTR or exposing to the right a number of times in the past, so I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but I want to summarize what I still do and a few other considerations that you might keep in mind if you're still formulating your own strategy. First of all, I want to mention that thanks to the wisdom received from Graham Natris, who's forgotten more about image processing than I'll ever know, I'm no longer talking about the cause of noise in images based on the old Luminous Landscape article that used to be my primary reference. Graham helped me to understand that the old explanation is not valid, but also that the benefits of exposing to the right are very real all the same. I have, though, been exposing to the right instinctively for many years, and experience has proved to me that my images are better quality for it, so I'm still using this technique for almost all of my work. Basically, what I do is expose my images so that the lightest part of the histogram data falls just short, if not slightly touching the right shoulder of the histogram. On the rare occasions when I find myself photographing a scene with the sun in the frame, I will allow it to become overexposed slightly to give myself some leeway in the shadows. But even then, one frame generally gives me enough dynamic range. As an example, here's a photo of a lighthouse with the late afternoon sun shining through the windows of the lantern room, shot on this year's Hokkaido Landscape Photography Tour. When looking through the viewfinder, as you might imagine, everything except the sun looked almost completely black. I could see from the histogram, though, that if I set my exposure so that the sun is just starting to overexpose, the shadows were not spiking up the left shoulder. Again, this is a comparison image that I'm showing you on the blog now. So you can slide the vertical bar from left to right to reveal more of the final processed image on the left and see how much detail I brought out in the bottom third of the photograph. All I did was ran a gradient mask over the bottom third and open up the shadows slider to around halfway. I also pulled out the shadows across the entire image with a very slight tone curve adjustment and placed a second gradient mask across the top of the sky to darken it down a little. This isn't the greatest image I've shot by a long shot, but I think it helps to illustrate my point. Basically, expose so that the information on the right of the histogram is just about, or in this case, just touching the right shoulder, and check to see if you have a spike on the left side. If you do see a spike on the left side, it means that the shadows are going to be completely black, which is similar to highlights going completely white, and means that it might be difficult or even impossible to recover any detail in these areas. As long as the shadows on the left side are not spiking though, there is detail in the shadows that can be used. Do also be aware that the camera's histogram is generally based on the JPEG preview, so it tells a somewhat harsher story than your image processing software will. Both Lightroom and Capture One Pro give you around a stop of light back compared to how the images look on the camera. I also use a piece of software called Raw Digger to check my images, especially ones like this, to see what the image really looks like, and I can also create a very detailed histogram, such as this one that I'm also showing on the blog. This is from the original RAW file of the photo that we just looked at. Note that the left and right shoulder of the Raw Digger histogram is much wider than the limits of the camera, so there is some space. We can still see a small spike on the right side of the histogram though, which represents the bright sky around the sun that I overexposed slightly. On the left side, you can see that the shadows taper off nicely, showing that there is a little bit of information lost, but enough to be able to bring out details in the shadows. I don't have a photo of the histogram on the camera, but here also are the two histograms from Capture One Pro, with the original RAW file on the left side and the processed RAW file on the right. You can see how the shadows were steep and close to the left shoulder, but still not spiking. Also note the small spike in the highlights for the sun, but see how I was able to bring that under control in Capture One Pro. Going a little over is rarely a problem, but we do need to avoid going over by a large amount. So as you can see, using the histogram as a tool can really help to make educated decisions about your exposure. Based on just the image or even what you see through the viewfinder, you might think that a scene like the lighthouse sunset would need multiple exposures merged together or even HDR processing, but in my opinion, it really isn't necessary unless, as I mentioned, you actually enjoy the process and that process feeds your creativity. For me, there's nothing more off-putting than getting home from a shoot and having to spend hours working on images, and as fast as the process may have become, as far as I'm aware, there are still no applications that will allow you to keep a processed and tone-mapped HDR image in RAW format. So you cannot benefit from the future processing engine updates. That example was for a high contrast scene, but as I said, I exposed to the right for all of my work, and I have received feedback from people in the know that the quality of my images is higher than most, and we attribute this to the way I shoot, taking control of my exposure. Basically, the darker your images get, the more noise you'll see in the shadows. I have talked about ISO invariance in episode 520, and I agree that if your ISO could be ISO 100, you can increase the exposure in post for a number of stops and really not see a lot of degradation in image quality. This means that especially when you're running and gunning and the light is changing so fast that manual exposure may cause you to miss shots, you can go to an automated mode and then brighten up the images in post if necessary. This is only the case though if the scene is bright enough that ISO 100 would get you to within 2 stops or 3 stops of your required exposure. Once your scene is so dark that ISO 100 does not get you to within 2 or 3 stops of your necessary exposure, the only option is to increase the ISO. And when you start to increase your ISO, you can't benefit from ISO invariance. Your only option for darker scenes is to increase your ISO, and if you're afraid to increase it high enough to essentially expose to the right, getting the histogram data as close to the right shoulder as possible, then your shadows are going to get noisy. Another thing that I want to add here is that it's also important to turn on and use highlight warnings or the blinkies in your camera so that you're made aware when small areas of the scene or subject start to become overexposed. For example, when photographing the dark-skinned Himba people inside their huts in Namibia, their eyes, teeth, and shells around their neck often start to overexpose as you increase the ISO, but it's virtually impossible to see this on the histogram. You have to check for these areas blinking in the preview image, or if you're using a mirrorless camera, some of them have these warnings in the electronic viewfinder too. Some people make the mistake of trying to get the peak or the hump of the histogram over to the right side when shooting images like this one of the young Himba girl. That will result in her eyes, teeth, and regalia all becoming overexposed. And although just a little is fine and controllable, we don't want to overexpose these areas too much. To be clear though, the goal is to increase the exposure to the point where the brightest parts of the scene or the subject are as close to the right side as possible, but not overexposing, and sometimes this requires us to increase the ISO so much that some people start to back off. This image was shot at ISO 5000, and that scares some people. But because I was still essentially exposing to the right until the bright areas start to overexpose, the shadows still have almost no grain to speak of. And this is with a 50 megapixel camera, which was supposed to be really bad in low light. The reality is that even with such high resolution cameras, if you push the ISO to the point that you need it to be at to give you an ETTR image, then the shadow areas will still be clean enough to give you a usable image. You might recall that this is one of the 10 images that I printed at 44 by 62 inches for display in an exhibition at Canon's headquarters here in Tokyo. And the feedback that I've received is that people were very surprised that this image was shot at such high ISO, and they were looking at a 5-foot tall print. So I think that's proof enough that my technique has helped me to create images of pretty high quality, often in somewhat challenging environments. This may be obvious already, and I certainly mention this a lot, but just to be thorough, I should also mention that I shoot almost exclusively in manual mode. I just find this easier as it enables me to get my camera set up for a specific scene exposing to the right, and then just shoot without having to worry about exposure compensation, which I find completely annoying. I know that some people like to just let the camera decide, and if your scene is bright enough, that ISO invariance will help you to brighten your images up as necessary without losing any image quality. You really won't be negatively affected by shooting in an automated mode. For me though, I've been shooting manual for so long that it's just more intuitive and second nature. Another thing that I wanted to talk about with regards to using ETTR techniques to get better quality images is that sometimes people quote the camera manuals and often say that a good histogram has one large hump and that should be in the middle of the histogram. Forget this if it's something that you tend to bear in mind, for two reasons. Firstly, having the data in the middle of the histogram may result in unnecessary noise in your images, especially in the shadow or dark areas. The other reason is that the histogram represents a mapping of all of the tones in the image. It is not uncommon for a histogram to have multiple spikes. This image, for example, has a spike on the right side that represents all the white in the cranes and the snow, and a spike on the left side for the dark background, and there is nothing in the middle, which is where the camera manuals will have you believe the data should be. Of course, as a guideline for an average scene, it's not a complete failure, as an example, but it's important to understand what the histogram represents so that it can be used as a tool to work towards shooting images of higher quality rather than allowing something you've been told to lead you to make mistakes. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to relay is that it is also not necessary to try to have your image data fill the histogram. Some scenes do not contain a wide enough range of tones to create a full histogram from the left to the right side. As an example, and to make one last point, here is another snow scene from Hokkaido. See if you can guess where the histogram spike will be for this image, and then drag that vertical bar over to the left to reveal the embedded histogram and see how close you were. Let's start to wrap this up now with a few last words on why I put this post together. I kept Evan's part about developing a style in the title, even though we didn't go into great detail on this, because I think that the way I shoot plays a large part in the look of my work. I don't have a distinctive style that comes with a type of processing because, as I've said, most of the time it isn't the processing that defines my work. That in itself is, to me, one of the most important things that I wanted to relay today. I've been told that people can tell my work because of the quality of the images, and I like to think that this is because of the care I take in my setting of the exposure and how careful I am to compose my images in such a way that they contain as few distracting elements as possible. A lot of my work is somewhat, if not straight on minimalist, but rarely cluttered, and I think that these things all inform my style. I'll stop writing for now and get this out there. I've already been writing for a day and a half, but there is still so much more to say related to this topic. I'll try to follow up next week with a discussion on some of the things that I consider as I decide on my compositions, as we really didn't get into that today. If there is anything else that you'd like me to cover, just drop me a line with the contact form or write a comment on the blog at mbp.ac/635. I always enjoy hearing from you. Thanks very much for listening today. If you enjoy this podcast, please share a link with your friends. Subscribe in iTunes or your favorite podcast program to ensure uninterrupted delivery. If you have a moment to rate the podcast or leave us a review in iTunes, that helps to keep us relevant. in the huge number of podcasts out there now. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter and Google+, and links to everything that I'm up to are at martinbaileyphotography.com, so do drop by and take a look. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, you take care and have a great week, whatever you're doing. Bye-bye.